Hello, CLA family, friends, colleagues, and community partners. Welcome back to our live stream and part 3 of our forgiveness application discussion. Friday night, we received some new IFRs and additional information that we're going to cover and unpack today. The new interim final rules consist of 26 pages that build upon what we learned from the loan forgiveness application and instructions that were originally released. And they cleared up several items and resulted in several questions. And now we have a few answers. A second set of interim final rules, also released on May 22nd and consisting of 19 pages, provide guidance with respect to the SBA loan review process, as well as some borrower and lender responsibilities associated therewith. Rick, Todd, and Jack are back with me today to discuss what we now know and what we're still waiting to learn. Welcome back, guys.
Hey, Jen.
As a bit of housekeeping, please know that we have people in the chat answering your questions and helping me to direct them live to our presenters. So please submit your questions throughout the program. Additionally, we have information available on our COVID landing page, which is continually updated with tools and resources, as well as our Contact Us button, where you could submit specific questions so that we can connect you with an advisor. That's at claconnect.com. Well, Jack, I'd like to start with you to discuss the IFR related to forgiveness. What did we learn from our review of that document this weekend?
Yeah, so we did get a few answers to some questions that we've been getting quite a bit on. The first one that people were really concerned about was we had this June 30th date out there that was the end of the covered period, and people were wondering if their loan didn't originate until later than that period would end after. Would there be a problem? So we did get clarification on that your covered period for your 56 days can go beyond the June 30th date. So that was positive and just took something out of the picture that we thought we knew already. One of the other areas that was really nice to get clarification on, though, was on bonuses and then also anything related to hazard pay, right? So there was a lot of references to wages and other things, but never a specific reference to whether or not bonuses were includable. So we did have a specific item there that did talk about bonuses being included, so that was good to hear. And then we also got a little guidance about how things are going to work in terms of non-payroll costs, and more specifically related to rent and utilities. And they actually gave us a great example there, how you could end up with almost 3 months worth of those types of costs included in there, because it's using that whole paid and incurred, right? And so if it's paid during the period, their example was you might pay the May and June bills, but then you might incur sometime in July as well, and then you could accrue that, and as long as you paid it by the next cycle, you could include those amounts in the forgivable amount. And so really you could end up with 2.5 to 3 months worth of those types of costs. Now the example unfortunately stopped short of what we were hoping to learn, which is, can you go back real far, right? Because they used 2 months as an example. One of those was before the covered period. And it also didn't give us any insight into whether or not you can do any prepayments, right? So if you pay, let's say, September or October rent during the covered period, would that be includable? I know there's a lot of people out there speculating that prepayments are allowable. We're just not comfortable with that as a position yet. We also did learn about a little more insight into how things work related to self-employed individuals or general partners. And, unfortunately, this was not great news. We hadn't really anticipated this, but group health care and retirement contributions for those individuals, unfortunately, are not includable as part of the forgivable costs. So your group health and your retirement benefits for your general employee pools are includable, but the maximum that you can get for an owner, basically, right, it's an active general partner or somebody like that, is limited to that $15,385, that $100,000 annualized amount, or 850 seconds of their amount from last year. So, those were a few things that did come up. We wish we would have gotten that prepayment guidance in there. And also, the other piece that wasn't specifically addressed is, can you pay things, payroll costs, outside of the 8-week period. The example that they used where you were paying something in arrears was specific to utilities or rent. It did not go to payroll costs, right? So they had a different example about payroll costs, but that was not really included in there. So we're still don't know if payroll costs can have more than 8 weeks in a forgivable period. We're not sure about that yet. So a lot of good things there, but really the bulk of what was in there was just really codifying what was already in the application that we saw, a week and a half ago. The one thing I do want to highlight to everybody, though, and we know that everybody out there is following the legislative process with bated breath right now, but we know that there's both the House and the Senate now have proposals out there that are going to introduce some flexibility into the PPP. And so in one case, the House's bill, I think, is up to 24 months, so making it an additional 16 weeks. And then the Senate bill is moving it to 16 weeks, so an additional 8 weeks. So I know there's a lot of talk and concern about how do I get that extra week of payroll in there? How do I get, maybe one more rent payment in there so I can maximize the forgiveness of the loan? We don't know if there's an extended period of time that comes out of this, what that'll mean from a forgiveness perspective. But we think that with that extended period of time, chances are you'll have plenty of time to use the loan proceeds on forgivable type things. So what we're suggesting to everybody is just take a few breaths, let it all settle. We should know things within the next probably 2 weeks or so on what's going to happen with respect to that, because both of those, the House and the Senate bills, have now been pulled out of the next large appropriations bill and really are standalone bills at this point. So this is really what we learned in the first IFR about forgiveness. But overall, it was, I think, a good piece, though.
Well, it's a good start, right? I mean, we'll have to follow legislatively what's going on in those proposed bills, but then also just look for any of the, FAQ guidance that hopefully will come out in the next few days. One question that just popped in from the audience is the owner cap for insurance also for C Corp or just for S Corps and partnerships?
So we think it has to do specifically with those folks that are not going through W-2 wages. And Rick, you may want to weigh in on this too, but I believe active general partners or Schedule C. So if you're paid through your K-1 effectively or on your Schedule C, that's where it's limited. If you're just compensated through like an S Corp or a C Corp, then it would be includable, I believe. Rick, I don't know if you're seeing anything different there.
No, I'd agree with you, Jack.
Okay, that's super helpful. And like I said, we'll keep our eyes open for those FAQs, hopefully have something more of those to cover on Thursday. Rick, while we've got you, during last week's live streams, we talked pretty high level about the forgiveness application. I was wondering if we could dive a little deeper into a couple of those calculations that generate the most questions that we're seeing in the chat again. Can you start with how exactly does the wage reduction work, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jen. So the CARES Act contains a provision that in order to maximize forgiveness basically requires wages to be at least 75% of the average wage during Q1 2020. So we'll walk through that in a bit more detail, though, since I know we do get a lot of detailed questions on this. First, I want to mention which employees we need to worry about in the first place, because this is a common source of confusion. We only need to consider employees who work during the covered period. So these would end up being the same people who are included in that Schedule A worksheet in the back of the forgiveness application. You can also exclude anyone who made over $100,000 during 2019, and that includes anyone who had a single pay period during 2019 that when you annualize that single pay period, it exceeds 100,000. Second, we should mention that even if a person is included, you do get some flexibility on top of that the first 25% reduction has no impact to your amount forgiven. Additionally, there's an exception for wage reinstatements. So if wages were reduced between 2/15 and April 26th, they can be reinstated by 6/30 and it won't reduce forgiveness. And unlike the FTE safe harbor test that we'll talk about in a moment, this is measured at an individual employee level, which can make a big difference. Another common question that we get is whether or not reductions in hours hurt forgiveness, because a reduction in hours also impacts the amount that you're paying that individual. The answer is it doesn't impact the wage reduction test. It might impact the FTE test if you're reducing hours, but you don't get hit twice, since the wage reduction test is just based on averages. It's not based on total wages paid. So with all that leading up to the calculation, now I'll briefly mention how the mechanics work for the calculation itself. So first, what you do is determine the average salary or hourly wage in Q1, and you compare that to the average during the 8-week period. For hourly employees, any decrease in excess of 25% is multiplied by 8 weeks and then multiplied by the average weekly hours during Q1. And note, you take the hours from Q1 rather than the hours during the covered period for that, which does make a difference if you're reducing hours. For salaried employees, it's essentially the same, but you skip the hours since you're using a weekly salary. And in both cases, the reduction is applied to the full 8-week period, regardless of whether or not the employee is employed during the full 8-week period. The result of the calculation reduces dollar for dollar then the allowable costs that factor into the forgiveness amount.
Excellent. I think that really helps kind of unpack that a little bit on the wage reduction test side. But there's also another big reduction test in the CARES Act for FTEs, and you kind of alluded to that earlier in your answer. Could you talk to us a little bit more about that as well?
Yeah, you're right, Jen. The other big test that'll impact borrowers potentially is the level of FTEs they have during the covered period versus a reference period. So let's start again with some basic questions. And first, we'll talk about how to count FTEs. There's 2 options that are provided in the application. The first option, you simply take hours divided by 40 per week, subject to a max of 1. So in other words, if somebody worked 45 hours in a week, that'll count as 1 FTE. If they work 30 hours, you divide that by 40 and it counts as 0.75, 3/4 of an FTE. The second option is a little bit simplified from that. Basically, anyone who works 40 or more counts as 1, and anyone who works less than 40 counts as a half FTE. Either way, whichever option you select, the main rule is you need to use those consistently. The next question we get from people is which periods need to be counted. If you really follow step by step through the application, many borrowers are going to need to analyze 6 different time periods when they're adding up how many FTEs that they have, which can be burdensome. But some borrowers can skip a number of those. And the main criteria for that is if you maintained or increased the number of employees and you maintained or increased the average paid hours of employees from 1/1/20 to the end of your covered period. There's a checkbox on the application that allows you to skip most of what we're about to talk about. However, for the majority of borrowers, we'll talk through the main formula here. So first, you take your allowable costs, less any wage reductions that we just talked about, and you multiply that by the FTEs in the covered period and divide that by the FTEs during the reference period. For reference period, you can either choose the lower of 2/15/19, which is last year, through June 30th of 19, or you can choose 1/1/20 through 2/29/20. And there's an additional option too if you're a seasonal employer. If the reference period ends up being higher than the covered period, it'll reduce the allowable costs that are potentially eligible for forgiveness. A couple of other questions we commonly get when you start thinking through this in detail is what else impacts FTEs. So I do want to point out that despite what I just said, there's no penalty that you get if during the covered period you had FTEs who were terminated between 2/15 and 4/26 of this year. You offered to rehire them in writing. It was a good faith offer, but they turned you down. They rejected that offer. That doesn't count against you. If you had to fire someone for cause, that doesn't hurt you. If somebody voluntarily resigns or voluntarily requests and receives a reduction in hours, again, that doesn't hurt you. The only caveat to all this is you only get to add those people back if you didn't replace them with a new employee. Also, I do want to mention that even if you go through all this and you do show a reduction, you still have a safe harbor that might exempt you from this. This applies if you reduced your FTEs between 2/15 and 4/26. and the FTEs as of 6/30, the pay period that includes 6/30, are at least as high as 215. I know I threw out a whole ton of different dates. Like I said, there's up to 6 different periods you have to measure when you're talking FTEs. The application does walk through to more details, and we're certainly happy to explain this as well.
Is there a place, I assume all of this is available on the website as well, if people want to kind of have a reiteration of that or an explanation and part of the forgiveness calculator?
Yeah, absolutely, Jen. We do have some articles that talk through some of the mechanics here. The forgiveness tool that CLA has walks through it in a much greater level of detail and helps go through a systematic process of assembling that information and calculating it. And if anybody does have difficulty, certainly, your CLA representative or any of us would be happy to talk you through that.
Excellent. Now I'm going to turn to Todd in just a second, but Jane Kim asked a question in the chat while you were talking, saying, can payroll costs for employees that are non-U.S. citizens be covered? So they've got that H-1B visa.
No, those would not be included. That is one thing I didn't mention specifically, but you do see in the applications as well as the guidance that has come out there before. We're only talking about employees whose principal place of residence is the United States. You wouldn't include wages of employees who have a different principal place of residence.
Okay. And just while we're still on this piece, there's a question also that came in from Casey Miller for you guys that says our organization is self-insured. We have a set premium for staff. So can we use our premium or do we have to use actual outlays?
I think on that one, you can actually use what you paid during that period of time. So don't forget, when you look at the non-cash components of payroll costs, right? So not the wages, but the group health and other things, that's going to be based on what you paid during the period of time. So to the extent you have self-insured plans or other things like that, you'll actually be getting the actual amounts paid included in your forgivable cost amount there.
Okay. Only thing that I'll add on to that too, since I know I've gotten the question a couple of times, the application does go into a little bit of detail defining if you have a self-insured plan, what to include. And some people have asked me if they have to subtract out employee contributions. You do need to subtract those out, and the application does specifically state that, where it was maybe only alluded to before.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good point.
And then one more question just about these periods. Temp 2010 asked, are there special rules to be applied to schools where our salaried staff are paid over 12 months for the 9 months that they work during the school year, or is there anything yet that addresses that?
The closest that I'm aware of to address something like that is there are some rules for seasonal employers. It's not that well defined what constitutes or who constitutes a seasonal employer, but there is quite a bit of flexibility for seasonal employers, both for loan sizing, there were some, and for forgiveness of which period to select. They just give you a date range, and you need to include a consecutive time period within that meets the requirements from an IFR.
Okay. I think that's super helpful, and we're going to keep answering these questions as they come in, but I think it's really important now, Todd, to pull you in to discuss what we might know on the lender side from the second set of IFRs that was released Friday night. Do you want to start with a quick overview?
Sure, I can do that, Jen. We knew a couple things coming into this, and that guidance reaffirmed that. We knew that the borrowers or the lenders were going to have to look at make sure the certifications of the borrower were all there, and also that the supporting documentation was complete. But we got a lot of more detail about what the lender's supposed to look at in those application forms. So with respect to the forms, we know that the lenders are supposed to confirm, and the word used there is confirm. And we're going to take that to assume, look at the documentation that was provided and the calculation of how it feeds into the line item. And that confirm relates to a few lines. So first, if you look at Schedule A, it's lines 1 and 4 on cash compensation. It's lines 6, 7, and 8 on non-cash compensation, and line 10 on compensation to owners. And then there's a few more on the 3508, the mortgage interest, the lease payments, the utility payments, and then line 10, the total payroll cost. Those are all specifically listed that the lender is supposed to confirm the calculation of those amounts. So when we look at that, that's good and bad. The good is we've got some specific guidance. It's nice to see that we know what's supposed to look at. Another good thing is that of those line items I mentioned, line 5 in that payroll reduction calculation that Rick was talking about, that was excluded. That's a good thing because that's a pretty complex calculation that could get very involved for lenders to look at, right? So keeping them away from that is good. But a couple downsides. While there was an example provided with respect to payroll, looking at the payroll expenses, and it said, well, lender, if the borrower submits payroll reports from a recognized third-party payroll processor, then we'd expect those procedures to be minimal. And if it's not, we expect them to be more involved. More involved procedures would be more appropriate. Again, good that that's some good guidance. Unfortunately, though, it's left to the lender at this point without additional guidance to determine who qualifies as that recognized third-party payroll processor. And then in a related matter, if confirming those amounts on those line items, it means looking at the documentation and the calculation, then any of the gray areas that Jack and Rick talk about with respect to borrower submissions, those are gray areas for the lender, and they may have to make decisions on how they define certain things that are allowable or unallowable for forgiveness. So when you think utilities and other costs that maybe have some gray area in them, it seems like right now, without more guidance, we'd have to define those. It's another downside, but we'll take the specific guidance that we got happily.
Excellent. So as they're reviewing everything, what are the required communications to the borrower at the end of the lender review?
Sure. First, I'm going to start out with reminding everybody that it's a 60-day process that the lender has to look at that. And the guidance did specify again that it will begin when the complete application is received by the lender. Now, again, what does that mean? Well, it for sure doesn't mean that the application was half filled out, but we're interpreting with a lack of guidance that to mean a point at which the lender has asked all the documentation that the lender has asked for has been provided. That's when that clock would start ticking. And then they'll evaluate it. And they've got 3 different decision types that they can inform the borrower of. So one is approval. Approval means whole or partial approval. So consider that if the entire forgiveness amount is approved, that's approval. If just $1 of forgiveness, that's still approval, partial approval. The second indication of a decision would be denial. That would be, of course, complete denial. And then there's a third category, and that's denial without prejudice. And that would be used if the loan is under review by the SBA. And that's when you get that. And then if the SBA, as part of its review process, determines that you're eligible, that they don't challenge the eligibility, then the borrower can go back to the lender and they can ask that the lender reevaluate their application for forgiveness. But in instances where the lender communicates to the borrower denial, those last 2 instances, they need to do that in writing. And then the borrower will have a process within 30 days of being notified of denial that they will be able to appeal that lender's decision and I'm assuming in the case of complete denial.
Excellent. So they've got some guidance and then there's a decision issued to the SBA. Do we know more about the SBA review of this process?
Yes, we do. They did give some insight into that process too. So first of all, I'll state that remember, the SBA can look at any loan at any time, and they made that very clear again in this IFR. But then they also said that they're authorized to look at 3 things. They listed these 3 things in the IFR. One is borrower eligibility. And when they look at that and looking at the components of eligibility, they specifically stated that they will request that the lender would contact the borrower in writing to notify them of any additional information request for eligibility if eligibility is in question. Also, if eligibility is in question, the SBA may reach out to the borrower directly and ask questions. And third, if eligibility is in question, the lender will provide all documentation to the SBA, all information that they've received. And so when you look at that, that's a pretty significant piece of request that they've made, and because it's an important decision. But that's one. The second is they're going to look at the loan amount and also the use of proceeds. Now, when I looked at that, the loan amount, that calculation, that's expected, fairly straightforward. The question that came to mind on use of proceeds is, if I consider an instance where eligibility might be in question and they've had to get access to a lot more information, that gives them a greater pool of information to review with respect to use of proceeds. Secondly, when I thought about use of proceeds from a lender perspective, I also thought about, all right, what happens if the borrower takes the view of, well, I'll just throw the kitchen sink of documentation at the lender to maximize my forgiveness. Well, that also means you may provide information that could indicate a use of proceeds that's outside the allowed uses within the program. So I would say right now, be careful of some of the being too aggressive, I'll say, in that stance, in instances where you weren't able to spend all the proceeds. Okay. And then last, a look at the loan forgiveness amount. And I think that's an obvious part of the process. But go ahead, Jen. I think you were going to ask another question.
Yeah, I am. I'm going to throw things off just a little bit. There was a question from Robert Thornton, as you say, like throwing things at the lender, from the borrower side. And it's just the timing's so great. So Robert asked, can the lender charge the borrower for review and or confirmation for internal costs or outside costs? Just wondering if that's a part of it before I...
No, there's no mention of those costs. And I think the program is pretty consistent in saying that the borrower would not bear any costs related to the program. So I think these are the type of costs and processes that the lender processing fee is expected to cover from beginning to end of the process.
Excellent. Sorry, and I know you have more you want to cover here on borrower and ineligibility effects and some of the clawbacks. So I didn't mean to interrupt your flow there. I just thought seeing that question and the idea that people could just throw everything at the lender and where the lender has some defense would be fun to throw in there.
No problem. The issue on eligibility is it has consequences. Ineligibility has consequences to both the borrower and the lender. That would be the point I would make there. Mm-hmm. And that the borrower obviously then wouldn't qualify for forgiveness, and also they'd have to pay back the proceeds. And we'd expect that not to be just paying that loan over the remaining term. And from a lender's perspective, ineligibility translates to them with their processing fee being at risk and being, them not getting that or having to refund that processing fee, as well as then that also could potentially impact their guarantee depending on the circumstances.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think that helps. I'm going to throw in a few questions as I bring everybody back here from the audience. The first one is from physical therapy consultants. They're asking, does an employee who is receiving short-term disability from a medical condition count as an FTE for the calculation of FTEs for forgiveness? Same question for somebody who's out on maternity. Could one of you guys address that while we're still together, please?
Yeah, happy to give it my best shot, Jen, and anyone's welcome to jump in here too. But, there's nothing that specific in the guidance that we've received so far other than FTEs are calculated based on hours paid. So usually the treatment would need to be consistent throughout that, in a lot of cases, an insurance is covering the short-term or long-term disability that somebody may go on. So therefore, you wouldn't count them as paid hours. They wouldn't go into the FTE calculation, and you wouldn't have to consider them in the other tests like the wage reduction test and so on. However, if it is the employer paying for it and they are being counted as paid hours, they're being paid a normal rate, I would think that might be a stronger case to include in there. But for a lot of employers, I think it's more likely it would be excluded from all the different tests throughout.
I think that's a good answer, and I think that really helps get to some clarity there. It looks like, I'm so sorry, there's another question coming in related to all of this on the impact on mergers and acquisition activities. Jack, do you think you could address that?
Yeah, thanks for that. I know that we've been talking about this a lot internally about how this is going to impact it. As Todd mentioned, now the SBA really has a period of up to 6 years now to look at these loans. And so if you think about it, if you're acquiring a company that had PPP loan forgiveness, now all of a sudden you've got this contingent liability out there, particularly if you've done a stock acquisition, right, rather than an asset acquisition. And now you get into questions like, well, do I have to escrow those funds? because what if there is this clawback at some point in time in the future? And so we do think, because of this elongated period here, that's going to be one of the things we see now as part of the standard due diligence process, and potential, reductions in purchase price as a result of this, or at least holdbacks if there's any kind of risk associated with that. So we do feel like there is going to be an impact on merger and acquisition activity related to this program.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. As we get close to our time, I think the other popular question that we're finding in here has a lot to do with this forgiveness tool that we've mentioned. I want to encourage everybody, unless the three of you has something maybe to say about that specifically, and I'll give you a second to do that. Definitely, I'd like to reference and have everyone check out the CLAconnect.com COVID landing page, as well as below me in the box is a link to subscribe to our emails. And I'd strongly encourage you, both clients and not, to subscribe to our emails so we can share up-to-date information with you around the forgiveness tool. And that would include a demo of the tool itself coming soon. So, and how we can continue to support you during this time. I know Jack and Rick, you guys work on that on a regular basis. Do you have anything to add before I close this out on that forgiveness tool and what people should bring to that?
No, I think that was perfect, Jen. Lots of information at those links. Certainly, we know everyone is going to need a different level of service, different level of assistance as we all try to work our way through the provisions that are out here and the ones that are still coming at us. So certainly, we're happy to have a conversation, work through those with each organization, and make sure we get you the help that you might need.
Yeah, thanks so much. And so please subscribe to those emails. And also, again, use the contact us button with your questions. If you're having trouble accessing any of the tools, let us know. If you have other specific topics that you'd like for us to cover on a more global basis and you'd like to see in future live streams, also add that in there too. That helps us develop content. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Really want to thank our guests today, to you in the audience for your questions, our moderators in the chat for all the support and great information and answers. Obviously, we're still waiting on a lot from the FAQs. We're hoping to see more legislative activity come through, and we'll keep you posted in live streams and again on our webpage as we learn more. Thanks again for watching today. We'll be back with you on Thursday with even more information about how we can support you during this time. Please be well, and we'll see you on Thursday.
Thanks.